hope,
Is it
okay.
on?
I think I turned it on, so I'm not used to this kind of mic, so I hope it works. I'm Cindy Corrie. I'm very pleased to be here. We came through the snow, and I think this is the strongest dose of winter I've experienced since my childhood in Iowa. So it felt a lot like going home, and I appreciate the opportunity to come. I just wanted to preface the main part of my remarks by saying that this, of course, has been a challenging journey for Craig and for me. And it really began before Rachel went to Gaza, when she first told us about her plans to go there. And we had to open our minds to that possibility. We had lived all of our adult lives with this conflict kind of in the background for us because we didn't have a direct connection there. And I feel like we're typical of many American families who lived with this all of our lifetimes and really didn't stop to look carefully at the situation and what was happening there. And our daughter helped us to do that. I think that this is one of the most important dialogues for all of us to participate in order to try to really make a difference in improving conditions and relations with our part of the world and other parts of the world. So I thank you for giving me an opportunity to just use my voice to share with you some of the thoughts that I've had in the last year. Is brave part of growing up? These were the words of my 2.5-year-old that I quickly scrawled into my journal. It was one of the rare entries that I took the time to make during my busy days mothering 3 young children. But Rachel had surprised me with her question. It was a noteworthy one, no matter who might ask it, but seemed particularly so coming from this little tow-headed 2.5-year-old of mine. So I jotted it down, only to rediscover it 20-some years later after Rachel was killed in Gaza. Is brave part of growing up? It wasn't unusual for Rachel to surprise us. From her earliest years, it was clear that she had a unique way of looking at the world and at her place in it. She was an observer of people, of places, and she had a special way of communicating what she saw that helped those of us around her to see as well, especially her family. Rachel's grandmother wrote of her, I think it was her feeling of connectedness, of belonging, that person-to-person relatedness that was so remarkable to her. Rachel's life didn't touch yours lightly. She impacted you. When asked what she would like to be when she grew up, Rachel would answer, I am a poet. But in her 5th grade yearbook, she wrote, I want to be a lawyer, a dancer, an actress, a mother, a wife, a children's author, a distance runner, a poet, a pianist, a pet store owner, an astronaut, environmental and humanitarian activist, a psychiatrist, a ballet teacher, and the first woman president. After turning 20, Rachel recalled her long-ago composed 5th grade list of ambitions, and she wrote to her grandmother with, I think, what is typical of her blend of humor and self-reflection at that time. Do you know that in a lot of pre-literate societies, people were given names that delineated their roles, like Joe Fence Builder or Bob Tiger Hunter, and they just identified completely with their job and did it well? Sometimes I think I'd be much more productive if my name was Rachel Soup Maker, and all I had to do was make the tastiest darn soups ever for my village. I wouldn't spend so much time racing back and forth between creative writing and teaching and journalism and psychology and film and sociology and ecology and ethnobotany and international relations, and the list goes on and on and on. I I remember when I graduated 5th grade, we had a list of questions for our yearbook. One of them was, what do you want to be when you grow up? Everyone wrote something like doctor, or astronaut, or Spider-Man. And then you turned the page, and there was my 5-paragraph manifesto on the million things I wanted to be, from wandering poet to first woman president. That was real cute in 5th grade, but when it's 10 years later, I'm going to be a junior in college, and I still don't have the conviction to cross Spider-Man off my list. Well, you can imagine it gets a little nerve-wracking. Gradually, though, Rachel began to identify what was important in her life, and to find direction, and to find her voice, and eventually to find her way to Gaza. She was curious, thoughtful, and she questioned. She questioned the role and impact of her country in the world, even the role of herself and of her family in the world. She was part of a vibrant learning community at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, and eventually she connected with a vibrant activist community in the Olympia, Seattle area as well. After 9/11, Rachel began to reflect on the effects of the U.S. war on terrorism, the rise of militarism within our government, the war in Afghanistan, and repression at home through the U.S. Patriot Act. Her response was to become deeply involved with several Olympia peace groups, students educating students about the Middle East, the Olympia Movement for Justice and Peace, Fellowship of Reconciliation, and the Peace and Justice Studies Association. She was active as well with the Labor Education and Resource Center and the Washington State Labor Council of the AFL-CIO. In April 2002, as a response to her peace work, Rachel led an effort to create a flock of doves for Olympia's Earth Day tribute, the Procession of the Species. This is an artistic community collaboration that culminates in a parade that honors all of life. Afterward, she wrote in celebration to me about what had been accomplished. I've danced down the street with 40 people from the ages of 7 to 70 dressed as doves. I think peace doves will happen again next year, and hopefully there'll be a procession institution. It's a community building opportunity for people who do peace work. It's intergenerational. It gives people in the Evergreen community a chance to work with people in the broader, progressive community. In a lot of ways, I think the procession is a value statement. I'm happy to see a peace message included in that. I think it's important for people who oppose war and repression to speak about who we are as a community, in addition to speaking about war and racism and injustice. We are not outside. I think it's important that human rights and resistance to oppression be included in the way we define ourselves as a community. Ignoring all other factors, I would choose to spend 8 hours a day for the rest of my life making things in a giant room full of people. Rachel was drawn to Palestine and Israel by people in her community who had connections to those places and were speaking out about them. By an Israeli woman who now lives in Olympia, whose family members had survived the Holocaust, who had grown up and lived in Israel for 29 years and was a co-founder of Women in Black and had become a powerful voice against the Israeli occupation. By activists, Rachel had also been influenced by activists who had spent years in the West Bank, and after seeing there seeing firsthand the humanitarian crisis there, had come back to Olympia and had continued their work there on this issue. And she was influenced by local ISM, International Solidarity Movement volunteers, who in the summer of 2002 traveled to the West Bank to join Palestinians in nonviolent resistance to the occupation. Rachel learned from all of these people, and she expanded her own study of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by reading, by checking out websites on the internet, and then she studied Arabic. Eventually, she began arranging her life so that she could save for and finance her own trip to Palestine. In January 2003, frightened but very determined, she left our home in Olympia, Washington, and traveled to Israel. She arrived nervously at David Ben-Gurion Airport and made her way to the West Bank for training with the International Solidarity Movement. In remarks at the United Nations in 2002, Huwaida Arif, who is one of the ISM co-founders, stated that there are only two stipulations for joining ISM. One must believe in the right to freedom of the Palestinian people, based on the relevant United Nations resolutions and international law. And one must agree to use only nonviolent direct action methods of resistance. Ms. Arif added, "The strength of ISM activists is not in arms. Their strength is in the truth and the justice of the Palestinian cause, and in believing that the Palestinian people deserve equal rights." Rachel accepted these premises. In the months since Rachel's killing, our family has had numerous opportunities to talk with ISM volunteers from this and other countries. The co-founders, two of the co-founders of ISM, Adam Shapiro and Huwaida Arif, were our first visitors in Washington, D.C., where we had gone to be with our son after learning of Rachel's death. They offered compassion and support during those first days. In Florence, Italy, where we went to receive the Silver Banner Award from the province of Tuscany on behalf of Rachel, ISM activists who had been Rachel's friends in Rafah came to meet us, to share stories with us, and to comfort us. In Vancouver, British Columbia, we met an older ISM couple who had been in the West Bank when Rachel was killed, but rushed to Rafah to provide support to the ISM group there after Rachel had died. And this couple, older couple, had actually stood in for our family as Palestinians came to offer condolences to the ISM group and to have what's called a shaheed for Rachel. There's kind of a funny aside to this, because Craig and I heard from people who had relatives in the West Bank and Gaza that their relatives had met us, and this was before we ever went there. And so for a while we wondered who were the Corrie imposters in the West Bank and Gaza. And then when we met Carol and Gordon in Vancouver, and understood that they had been there immediately and had greeted Palestinians who had come to offer their condolences, that because of language barrier and so forth, people had thought that they were Craig and I. In September, when Craig and I journeyed to Israel and Palestine, Palestinian members of ISM greeted us with roses at Erez checkpoint in Gaza, and then lovingly guided us through our 6-day visit in Rafah, and had an amazing task to do, because many people there wanted to spend time with us, and I can't say enough about the work that the Palestinian ISM members did for us there. In London, we met Tom Herndahl, who was shot in the head approximately less than a month after Rachel was killed in Gaza. Tom was killed along the same border strip area. He had been taking part in a protest at a street that an Israeli APC kept entering and threatening people who were going to the mosque there. And so Palestinians and internationals went out to protest. And firing started from there's a tower, an Israeli watchtower in the distance. I've been at the spot now. And firing started from the tower at the people. And there were children in the area. And Tom, they decided to disperse the protest. But Tom went to help small children who had been in their fear, really, had gone in the wrong direction. And he went over to help them to safety and was shot in the head. And he was in a coma for many months. Many of you may know that in just the last couple of weeks, Tom did die in London. But we were glad to have some time with him and with his family in London Wherever we travel, we are always sought out by members of the ISM family. We have been impressed with them, with their thoughtfulness, their intelligence, their dedication, and of course their courage. Those we have met are young and old and in between. They come from many countries, the United States, Canada, the UK, Sweden, Italy, Australia, and occupied Palestine. They are Jewish, Christian, Muslim. 20% of the ISM are Jewish, from the Jewish faith. I think they travel to Palestine to learn, to see for themselves, and with the hope that through nonviolent direct action and witnessing, that they will help to hasten the coming of a just resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In January 2003, after her training in the West Bank, Rachel was quickly off to Rafah, where she began to settle into the ISM operation there. She chose to go to Rafah because she felt that it was one of the most forsaken places in the world. She recognized that there was danger, but she hoped and believed that foreign nationals, especially those from Israel's strongest ally, would not be intentionally harmed. Speaking of Rachel after her death, one of her professors at Evergreen said, "Rachel was brave and she was principled, but she had no savior complex. She was not full of herself that way." There were phone calls home to us, and I remember very well the very first phone call that we had from Rachel. She was staying in a house that is along the border strip, along the Egyptian border. It was late at night, and when she talked to us, her voice was trembling, and she said, I could hear the fear in her voice, and I think for me it was the moment when I first realized really what the danger was. And she said, "Can you hear that? Can you hear that?" And you could hear the shelling in the background that was coming from the border. So initially, there was a lot of fear, but then I think she really grew in her confidence and in her determination, and said that it was the Palestinian people themselves, I think, that gave her a great deal of courage to continue the work there. Then her emails began. "I have been in Palestine for 2 weeks and 1 hour now, and I still have very few words to describe what I see. It is most difficult for me to think about what's going on here when I sit down to write back to the United States. Something about the virtual portal into luxury. I don't know if many of the children here have ever existed without tank shell holes in their walls and towers of an occupying army surveying them constantly from the near horizons. I think, although I'm not entirely sure, that even the smallest of these children understand that life is not like this everywhere. An 8-year-old was shot and killed by an Israeli tank 2 days before I got here, and many of the children murmur his name to me, Ali, or point at the posters of him on the walls. Love you, really miss you. I have bad nightmares about tanks and bulldozers outside our house, and you and me inside. Sometimes the adrenaline acts as an anesthetic for weeks, and then in the evening or at night it just hits me again, a little bit of the reality of the situation. I am really scared for the people here. Nadal's English gets better every day. He's the one who calls me my sister. He started teaching grandmother how to say, "Hello, how are you?" in English. You can always hear the tanks and bulldozers passing by, but all of these people are genuinely cheerful with each other and with me. Rachel told us that going to Gaza was one of the most important things she had done in her life. With other activists, she spent nights sleeping at wells in Rafah to protect them from demolition. She stood between the municipal water workers who went to repair the wells and were being fired upon from the towers, the Israeli towers in the distance. And so the internationals would stand in order to offer some protection to those municipal water workers. She documented the destruction of olive orchards, gardens, and greenhouses, as well as harassment of Palestinians at checkpoints. She learned Arabic from Palestinian children and helped them with their English homework. She drank sweet tea with Palestinian grandmothers, held wiggling babies, and danced with Palestinian children. She wrote, "Know that I have a lot of very nice Palestinians looking after me. I have a small flu bug and got some very nice lemony drinks to cure me. Also, the woman who keeps the key for the well where we sleep keeps asking me about you. She doesn't speak a word of English, but she asks about my mom pretty frequently, wants to make sure I'm calling you." In a recently published book, Live from Palestine, Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, president of the Union of Palestinian Medical Relief Committees, writes that since the beginning of this intifada, Palestinians have pleaded for international protection. But he adds, it was not UN troops in smart uniforms who took up positions in our villages and cities, nor was it US soldiers storming ashore as in Somalia. It was individuals who responded to our calls, and small groups from trade unions and churches, anti-globalization activists, committees from the World Social Forum, Jewish and Christian groups opposed to the occupation, as well as those belonging to Palestinian solidarity groups. These people came, even at the risk of injury, arrest, and deportation, to stand side by side with Palestinians against the military occupation. Whether they came to break the siege, protect the children going to school, or to pick olives, they have come. On March 16th, according to 7 eyewitness accounts, Rachel was crushed by an Israeli D9 bulldozer while she stood trying to prevent the demolition of the home of a Palestinian pharmacist, his wife, and 3 young children near the Egyptian border. Rachel wrote to us about this area, and she said, "Today, as I walked on top of the rubble where homes once stood, Egyptian soldiers called to me from the other side of the border. 'Go, go,' because a tank was coming, followed by waving and 'What's your name?' There is something disturbing about this friendly curiosity. It reminded me of how much, to some degree, we are all kids, curious about other kids. Egyptian kids shouting at strange women wandering into the path of tanks. Palestinian kids shot from the tanks when they peek out from behind walls to see what's going on. International kids standing in front of tanks with banners. Israeli kids in the tanks anonymously, occasionally shouting, and also occasionally waving. Many forced to be here, many just aggressive, shooting into the houses as we wander away. The Israeli military has demolished hundreds of homes in Rafah, as well as fields, orchards, and greenhouses. The Palestinian Center for Human Rights reports 641 houses in Rafah completely demolished and 459 partially demolished from the beginning of this intifada through September of last year. 6,247 Palestinians in Rafah had their homes completely destroyed during this time. Peter Hansen, the Commissioner General of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency in Gaza, wrote on June 23rd, "There is a daily grind in Gaza, a grinding of bulldozer gears, the churning of heavy machinery, and the crash of concrete on concrete accompany it. Together, this is a soundtrack of misery and despair. It is the sound of another family home being demolished." Throughout the West Bank and Gaza, very few of the demolitions target the families of suicide bombers or of those wanted by Israel. Instead, the victims are simply people living in the wrong place at the wrong time. Those living near the Egyptian border in Rafah in the south of Gaza have the misfortune of being in a place where Israel is widening its security zone at the border. Hundreds of homes, dozens of small shops, mosques have all been completely destroyed and turned into rubble. Peter Hansen concludes, Israel has legitimate security concerns and much suffering of its own, but its security is poorly served by a policy that creates fresh anger and despair every day. What is needed is a just and durable peace that will allow the children of Gaza to again sleep soundly at night. The house Rachel was protecting was threatened because of its location near the border strip and steel wall, which is being built near the Egyptian border. And Craig and I have visited and seen the strip and seen the wall there. An eyewitness described the bulldozers that day plowing up the land in front of the buildings and making occasional runs at houses. From a distance, the activists stood and sometimes knelt in the bulldozers' paths, indicating their intention not to move. The bulldozers would approach very close to the activists. One bulldozer was reportedly more aggressive that afternoon than the other, and on one occasion pushed one of the other activists into razor wire before finally withdrawing. But always the driver stopped in time to avoid injuring the activists. When the two bulldozers, each with two operators aboard, and the APC vehicle retreated to the border strip for a time, the activists felt that maybe they had been successful that day in preventing demolitions, and they in fact called to their coordinator and indicated that. But then the bulldozers returned, and a few minutes later, Rachel was killed by the same bulldozer that had behaved more aggressively toward the activists earlier in the afternoon. Eyewitnesses tell us that the bulldozer began a straight run at Dr. Samir's house. Rachel was wearing her fluorescent orange jacket with reflective striping. She knelt down well in front of the bulldozer and began waving her arms and shouting, just as activists had successfully done earlier that day. But this time the bulldozer, with its two operators on board, continued moving straight for Rachel. We are told that when it got so close that it was moving the earth beneath her, that she climbed onto the pile of debris being pushed and was high enough to be at eye level with the cab of the bulldozer. Despite this, the driver continued forward, pulling Rachel into the pile of rubble and out of view. Activists ran toward the bulldozer, waving and shouting, one with a megaphone. But the driver continued forward until Rachel was beneath the cab. The bulldozer stopped over Rachel for a few seconds and then reversed without lifting its blade, dragging the blade over Rachel's body one more time. On March 16th, our family lost a cherished sister and daughter. The world lost a woman who had clearly found her voice as a writer and was beginning to find her voice as a peace activist. In Rafah, they said Rachel was the woman who came to stop the tanks. In Athens, they referred to her as she who would not retreat. In her hometown, Olympia, Washington, they call her peacemaker. It's clear in the choices that my daughter made that she had answered for herself the question that she voiced to me over 20 years earlier. Is brave part of growing up? Yes, Rachel, brave is part of growing up. Now, may we all find the courage to take whatever steps are necessary and whatever steps we have it in our power to take to fight against oppression wherever we find it, and for human rights, for justice, and then finally for peace. Thank you very much.
writing about them and making them very real to other people, which was one of her gifts from her emails to her mother. So if you haven't had a chance and would like to know more about Rachel, reading her emails, which you can find out on rachelcorrie.com website, is something I'd encourage you to do. Also, I'd like to, before I start, just kind of say something. I'm going to put on some slides here, but it's not going to be a travel log. I'm just going to put up some slides that will give you something to think about while I talk. And I kind of like to talk about this first picture, tell you a little bit about the first picture that's up here, which I noticed that you've got, and of course is around the world. But this picture was taken about 18 months ago in Nevada. And it was, our daughter Sarah talked to the photographer. And it turns out that the photographer is an Israeli young man, born in Israel. And when he saw the pictures, the other pictures that you've got over here of Rachel being injured, lying injured, that first day after she was killed, he was living in Seattle and he wanted to get a beautiful picture of Rachel out. So he put this picture out. And she was sitting, writing, and he was trying to get this picture. For about 20 minutes, he said, and every time she looked up, she would mug or make a face or something so he couldn't take the picture. But finally, she got into her writing so much that she just looked up trying to search for a word, and he got the picture, for which I'm very grateful. So if this works right, you're going to start clicking through, and that'll every 10 seconds give you something else to look at. And it doesn't particularly, I don't know what I'm going to say, so it won't necessarily coordinate with that.
But these were all, I'll just add that these were pictures taken when we were in Rafah in Gaza, and then some villages in the West Bank.
But that happens to be going into Rafah.
These are the
Mohammed and
Palestinians who greeted us.
And so I just wanted to talk to you, because Rachel brought people that she met to us, and I think it's important. I want to talk to you a little bit about our trip. We had to, for our own healing, go to Rafah in September and meet some of the people that she met and see what she saw, kind of walk where she walked. And so I want to talk to you about 5 families, sort of 4 families, but the 5th group is some ambulance drivers, and they're like a family too. So when we went to Rafah, I think on Monday the 15th of September, we immediately went to Dr. Nasrallah's house. That's the Palestinian pharmacist whose house Rachel was standing in front of when she was crushed. Just kind of as an aside, that house that was out at the end of a street, which is completely cleared on one side. It goes towards the border with the Egyptian border there, and Rafah is divided in half. It was on the border with Egypt. So half of the city of Rafah is in Egypt, half of it is in the Gaza Strip, and the Israeli army is bulldozed down some houses and putting up a large steel wall about 2.5 stories high and I believe about a story deep into the sand there to divide the city of Rafah in half. And this pharmacist's house is close to that wall, about 200 meters from where they're putting in that wall. It bulldozed down the houses that are closer to that wall, and all down one side is very exposed going out there. And so before we were to go out there, we were to call the Israeli military and tell them that we were coming. 20 minutes before we left to go there, we told them we were coming. We gave them a description of the car, we gave them the car license plate, we told them how many people were in the car, and then we left to go meet our hosts and have lunch with them. We were inside, and we met the family, inside trying to have lunch, and the doctor and another Palestinian came to get me and asked me to look out the front door. And when I did, there's an armored personnel carrier less than the distance, about half the distance to the back of this auditorium, covering the front door. And then they asked me to go look through the crack in the wall where the doctor had seen Rachel killed, and here's the bulldozer coming straight for the house. So I called back to the IDF and told them sort of what I thought of that greeting. And in fact, they did move off to the side, kind of mucked around for the rest of the day, but it was an abrupt welcome for us to the town of Rafah for our first afternoon there. But we stayed the afternoon with the Nasrallah family. We met with her 3 small children. Cindy sat out in the garden with the smallest little girl and stroked her rabbit with her. And then we left. Later on, we went to Nala's house. Nala was a friend of Rachel's, a young woman, and we were there in the afternoon. We had lunch with them as well, and on a Wednesday, and we could look out from their porch. We could look out on the out again on the sand and the homes that had been destroyed along the border and at the steel wall they were putting up. And we had a nice lunch with them. That was on Wednesday afternoon. On Friday, we came back because we learned that on Thursday evening, the IDF at about midnight had come to Nyla's house, and they sent dogs over the wall of that porch that we were on into the house, rounded up the family, took Nyla and another young woman into a separate room, and at gunpoint asked them, "Where are the tunnels? Where are the tunnels?" They stayed there for 5 hours. In the end, they dug a trench, clearly with a backhoe, in the garden that used to be in front of their house, piling the dirt up against the house. And in that process, it was clear to me, they took the shovel or the backhoe and knocked in the wall of the room in which we had had lunch on Wednesday, and this trench to discover the tunnels that they thought somebody was smuggling, I don't know, arms or something in from Egypt. So we went back and saw where this had all happened. And doing that, I then stepped off of this porch up onto the dirt, maybe 4.5 feet or so out from the wall of their home, to look into that trench and see for myself if there were tunnels. And indeed, there are no tunnels. But while I was out there for maybe 30, 40 seconds, the shots rang out. They're warning shots. Of course, if they weren't warning shots, I wouldn't be telling you about it. And if a bullet's close, I know from my experience in Vietnam, if a bullet's close, you can hear the snap of it come past your head. They weren't that close to snap, a shot, but they're clearly warning shots. So we left Nyla's house. We went to Abu Ahmed's house. Abu Ahmed likes to argue politics like almost every Palestinian I've met. It's a national pastime. And so we listened. He's got quite good English, and so we could listen to him tell us. Actually, amazingly, he's older general, older than even I. He's a really older gentleman, and so he could. It's amazing. He could give us sort of a description of each of the occupations, kind of rank the occupations back from 52 and say, this occupation was better than that one, and the English really wasn't so bad, and unfortunately this occupation, he felt, was the worst. So it's interesting meeting Abu Ahmed. We went then for another dinner to Abu Jamil's house. Abu Jamil lives on Abu Jamil Street. And at the end of that street, there's an Israeli watchtower. We were going there in the evening, so we parked a car kind of around a corner and then walked very close to the wall, because from those towers they shoot down these streets. And so we were concerned. We had dinner, we looked in his house, there are bullet holes coming through the kitchen. You see the bullets from outside wall and then embedded in the inside wall of the kitchen. As in fact they were in Dr. Nasrallah's house. His children could not be in their bedroom after 7 o'clock at night because the machine gun would be fired through their bedroom, so they slept on the floor in the back of that house. When we left Abu Jamil's house, then Abu Jamil, as our host, came out, took us back to the car, and he walked proudly, slowly, right down the center of that street, took us back to the tower, and took us to the relative safety of our car. Another place that I wanted to talk to you about is the ambulance drivers. We went to the ambulance drivers. I thought simply what we're going to hear there is about what happened to Rachel, because they were the ones that picked up Rachel, and indeed they did tell us about that. But they also told us about what had happened the night before we got there. The night before, there had been a very small incursion into the center of Rafah, And a tank had gotten in somehow very quietly and parked itself back in a corner where nobody knew it was there. And that tank shot a young man going to the mosque very late at night. So the ambulance wanted to go pick up this person who's bleeding. He was shot, I believe, 18 times, but low in the legs, so he's actually still alive. And to do that, they told us that they sent 3 ambulances. 2 ambulances went in a rather direct manner straight to where he was, and the tank then came and fended off these ambulances and kept them from picking up this young man. But the 3rd ambulance went around a back way and snuck in the back, and while the 2 ambulances kept the tank busy, the 3rd one picked up this young man. And there was no weapon on him or anything. Found no weapon. And we got this man to the hospital. While we were there, we also saw a film of one of the ambulance drivers picking up 2 small children from where there was gunfire from the Israelis. And he's running with a child who had been wounded in his hands to get him back to the ambulance. He was shot right across the ear, and he lost the hearing in that ear, although he didn't stop or anything. He got the child into the ambulance and kept going, but you can see his wound there. But the other thing he said, it let us know that, of course, the ambulance drivers are the ones always on the front line because they have to go pick up whoever's injured. So what we didn't realize is that these people knew Rachel. Rachel would come in the morning to find out what's happening, and part of what she was doing was trying to relate what was happening there. So she'd come around the corner in the morning, and I think they told us the morning that she was killed, that she'd come in and talk to him and try to find out what was going on and talk to him about what had happened the night before. So she was somebody, it was a nice picture to me because she was somebody that was expected, just around the corner in Rafah, as in Olympia, with her smile, and in Rafah usually with a kind of a puddle of children around her that would come with anybody from the West that's there. What I'd like to tell you about each of these families is this January, the homes of Naila, Abba Jamil, Dr. Nasrallah now have all been bulldozed down. Those homes are crushed. Abba Ahmed as well, they're gone. They've been done. And in October, in the largest incursion ever into Rafah, the ambulance driver was shot and died a few days later, we're told. So the destruction there goes on. And tell you what, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes, I hope. And this maybe we should already close, but I just want to read you one more thing. I know Cindy read some stuff that Rachel wrote. But she compared our life in North America to their life there. And she said, on February 7th, Rachel wrote to Cindy, I think about the fact that no amount of reading, attendance at conferences, documentary viewing, and word of mouth could ever prepare me for the reality of the situation here. You just can't imagine it unless you see it. And even then, you're always well aware that your experience of it is not at all the reality. What would the difficulties the Israeli army would face if they shot an unarmed U.S. citizen? And with the fact that I have money to buy water when the army destroys wells. And the fact, of course, that I have the option of leaving. Nobody in my family has been shot driving in their car by a rocket launcher from a tower at the end of the major street in my hometown. I have a home. I am allowed to go see the ocean. Ostensibly, it's still quite difficult for me to be held for months or years on end without trial. This is because I'm a white U.S. citizen, as opposed to so many others. When I leave for school or work, I can be relatively certain that there will not be a heavily armed soldier waiting halfway between Mud Bay and downtown Olympia at a checkpoint with the power to decide whether I can go about my business and whether I can get home again when I'm done. So, if I feel outraged at having arrived and entirely briefly and incompletely into the world in which these children exist, I wonder, conversely, about how it would be for them to arrive in my world. They know that children in the United States don't usually have their parents shot, and sometimes get to see the ocean. But once you have seen the ocean, and lived in a silent place where water is taken for granted and not stolen in the night by bulldozers, And spend an evening when you didn't wonder if the walls of your home might suddenly fall inward, waking you from your sleep. And meet people who have never lost anyone. Once you've experienced the reality of a world that isn't surrounded by murderous towers, tanks, armed settlements, and now a giant metal wall. I wonder if you can forgive the world for all the years of your childhood spent existing, just existing, in resistance to the constant stranglehold of the world's fourth largest military apparatus, backed by the world's only superpower in its attempt to erase you from your home. That is something I wonder about these children. I wonder what would happen if they really knew. Thank you.
To know that this is a Palestinian-led, nonviolent movement, nonviolent resistance. Mohammed had studied engineering in Bangladesh, has an engineering degree, speaks wonderful English, which was a great help to me, of course. But of course, there's no work for him, no engineering work for him in Gaza, in Rafah, where he's living now. This is actually the bulldozer that came in the day that we were at Dr. Samir's house, after we had notified the Israeli military that we were coming. And this is the Nasrallah family. We gathered around the floor, and here Dr. Samir is showing us, explaining to us the area where Rachel was killed. And these are the children. Intima is Dr. Samir's wife, a wonderful, warm mother. This is a little girl that has a pet rabbit that she sits in the sand pile outside. Her father was worried about her because she sits in the sand and sifts the sand, he tells me, for hours, and just sits through the sand. And he feels that it's not, it seems soothing to me when I watched her, but he feels it's not normal for her to spend as much time with this. They have one other daughter. Schools are double shifted because it's so crowded there. And so the first children, these two, leave at like 6 or 6:30 in the morning to go to school. And their sister was in the afternoon session, which starts around noon.
But just something I was thinking about when you said that in the morning. All night long in Rafah, every night we went to sleep with machine gun bullets coming from the tank, and you hear the tanks firing over the city. And in the morning, that probably usually starts in 11 o'clock at night, but in the morning, it's still going on. So you have the sounds, you juxtapose the call to prayers, the children talking and yelling back and forth, and machine guns coming, and also sometimes the explosion if they're demolishing a house by explosions. It's really...
And these two children took me into their bedroom, pointing out the bullet holes in the bedroom, so that they can't be in there at night, certainly. But then showed me their English and Arabic books, and the youngest, the little girls, they were trying to get me to say all of the words and were disappointed in my pronunciation, I think. And they said, Rachel learned every single one of these words. So they thought I should be faster at it. There was a group, actually, that came from the United States, and there have been people that have gotten into Rafah that helped to prepare that memorial plaque, but it can't be left in the spot because it would be simply destroyed, so they've taken it from there now.
It's because I've got time.
Anyway, we don't have to keep doing this. We can go to the questions now, but I thought...
Yeah, as soon as you got them, we can do that.